There's a headline going around right now claiming eggs reduce Alzheimer's risk by nearly half. And if you just read that headline, you'd assume the science is settled. Eat eggs, dramatically cut your risk of dementia, done. I'm not here to tell you that study is fake or that the researchers did something dishonest, but I am going to show you exactly how a number like that gets built, what it actually means versus what people assume it means, and more importantly, walk you through the real, well-documented biology connecting eggs to brain health. Because once you understand the actual mechanisms, you won't need a flashy headline to know why this food deserves a second look. Stick around through all three parts because by the end, you'll understand not just whether eggs matter for your brain, but why, down to the specific molecules involved, and why decades of cholesterol advice may have gotten the story backwards. What that 47% number actually means. Before we even get to the biology, let's slow down on the headline itself, because this is a skill that will serve you well for the rest of your life every time you see a splashy nutrition claim. When a study reports something like a 47% reduction in Alzheimer's risk, most readers immediately translate that in their head to, if I eat eggs, my personal risk drops by 47%. That is almost never what the study actually measured. What's typically happening is a comparison between two groups, often a group with relatively healthy overall dietary and lifestyle patterns that happens to include regular egg consumption, versus a group with a notably less healthy pattern overall. When you compare a healthier group to a less healthy group, you're going to find a meaningful difference in disease risk almost no matter which single food or habit you focus on. Because the groups differ in dozens of ways simultaneously, not just egg consumption. That doesn't mean eggs contribute nothing to the result. It means the specific number, 47%, is a comparison between two broad lifestyle patterns, not a controlled measurement of egg consumption in isolation. To actually isolate the effect of a single food, you'd need a very different kind of study design, one that controls for the dozens of other variables that differ between generally healthy and generally unhealthy populations. Those studies are harder, slower, and more expensive to run, which is part of why the simpler, flashier version tends to be the one that makes headlines. Who's behind the research? The second thing worth knowing before you accept a nutrition headline at face value is who funded it and who benefits from the result. This particular research area around eggs has in some cases been funded through industry-connected organizations, bodies that exist specifically to promote egg consumption and that draw funding from the egg production industry itself, sometimes with major producers directly represented on governing boards. To be clear, industry funding doesn't automatically mean a study is fraudulent or the methodology is flawed. Plenty of well-designed, legitimate research is industry-funded, and plenty of independently funded research still has real limitations. But funding source is a piece of context you deserve to have before deciding how much weight to put on a single number, because it can influence which questions get asked, which comparisons get highlighted, and which results get promoted the loudest. A quick primer on how these studies actually work. It helps to understand the basic structure of the research behind headlines like this because the same pattern repeats across nutrition journalism constantly. Most large-scale nutrition studies looking at something like Alzheimer's risk are observational, meaning researchers track a large group of people over years or decades, record what they eat and how they live, and then look back at who developed the disease and who didn't. They're not randomly assigning half the group to eat eggs and the other half to avoid them, and then controlling every other variable in a lab. Observational studies are genuinely useful. They can reveal patterns worth investigating further. And running a true randomized trial on something like eggs and Alzheimer's risk over a 20-year timescale is often impractical or impossible. But the trade-off is that observational studies are vulnerable to what researchers call confounding variables, other factors that travel alongside the one being studied and make it hard to isolate cause and effect. Someone who regularly eats eggs as part of a varied whole food diet is also statistically more likely to exercise regularly, sleep reasonably well, drink less, smoke less, and generally engage with their health more proactively than someone whose diet consists mostly of ultra-processed convenience food. When researchers compare these two broad groups, egg consumption becomes a marker for an entire cluster of healthier behaviors, not necessarily the isolated cause of the improved outcome. Good researchers try to statistically adjust for as many of these confounders as they can measure. But it's genuinely difficult to account for every relevant variable, and some degree of residual confounding almost always remains. This is exactly why the more interesting and more reliable story usually isn't the headline statistic. It's the mechanistic research. Studies that isolate specific compounds, track them through cell biology and animal models, and build a case based on how something works, not just a population-level correlation. That's where we're headed next. So let's set the headline number aside entirely and actually dig into the real biology, because there's genuinely fascinating, well-supported science here that doesn't need an inflated statistic to be compelling. What an egg actually is. Most people mentally file eggs under protein source, the same category they'd put chicken breast or a steak in. But that framing undersells what an egg actually is. An egg isn't just a protein delivery mechanism. It's a self-contained package designed by evolution to build an entire organism from scratch, complete with everything a developing chick needs to grow: a brain, a nervous system, bones, and organs. That purpose shows up in the sheer molecular complexity of a single egg. Researchers have cataloged over 850 distinct proteins inside one egg, each with its own function. A few are worth knowing about specifically. Lysozyme is a naturally occurring antibacterial protein found in eggs. In research trials, it's been associated with measurable reductions in blood pressure on the order of several points. IgY antibodies, a type of immune protein present in eggs, have shown meaningful reductions in H. pylori, the bacteria linked to stomach ulcers, in randomized trials. Ovotransferrin, a protein studied specifically in Alzheimer's-related animal models, has shown improvements in memory performance in those studies. There's also a protein studied in postmenopausal women that appears to support bone density maintenance, relevant given how significantly bone density risk rises after menopause. None of these individually make eggs a miracle food, but together they paint a picture of a food that's doing a lot more biologically than simply supplying amino acids. Choline, the nutrient almost nobody talks about. This is where things get genuinely important for brain health specifically, and it centers on a nutrient called choline. Your brain communicates between neurons using a chemical messenger called acetylcholine. Think of it as a signaling molecule that carries information across the tiny gaps between nerve cells, allowing thoughts, memories, and motor commands to actually move through your nervous system. In Alzheimer's disease, the neurons responsible for producing acetylcholine are among the very first to die off, which is a significant part of why memory and cognitive function decline the way they do in this condition. Choline is the raw material your body uses to manufacture acetylcholine. Without adequate choline intake, your body simply doesn't have the building blocks to keep that communication system running at full capacity. Here's where eggs become genuinely remarkable. 2 eggs provide roughly 300 milligrams of choline, more than you'll find in almost any other commonly eaten food, with liver being one of the only foods that competes. If eggs and liver aren't regular parts of your diet, there's a real chance you're not getting enough choline, since most other common foods contain it in far smaller amounts. The Alzheimer's drug connection. Here's a detail that puts this in sharp perspective. Look at how the most widely prescribed Alzheimer's medications actually work. Their primary mechanism isn't increasing acetylcholine production. It's slowing down the enzyme that breaks acetylcholine down after it's used. In other words, these drugs work by preserving whatever acetylcholine is already present for slightly longer, rather than helping the brain make more of it in the first place. That raises an obvious question worth sitting with. If the entire pharmaceutical strategy revolves around protecting existing acetylcholine, wouldn't it make sense to also focus on ensuring the brain has enough raw material, choline, to keep producing acetylcholine in the first place? This isn't an argument against medication for people who need it. It's an argument that dietary choline intake deserves to be part of the conversation, not an afterthought. Lutein, the brain's preferred antioxidant. The next standout nutrient in eggs is lutein. And what makes it interesting is how selectively the brain uses it. Among the many antioxidants circulating in your bloodstream, the brain preferentially pulls in and concentrates lutein above nearly all the others. It appears to play a specific protective role for the myelin sheath, the fatty insulating layer that wraps around nerve fibers and allows electrical signals to travel efficiently along them. Not all eggs are equal here, though. Conventional caged eggs and even cage-free eggs contain noticeably less lutein than pasture-raised eggs, where hens have access to varied outdoor foraging. Pasture-raised eggs have been measured at roughly 4 to 5 times the lutein content of conventional caged eggs. A meaningful difference if brain-specific nutrition is your priority. Why the brain loses access to its fuel. To understand why any of this matters for a condition like Alzheimer's, it helps to understand what's actually going wrong at the cellular level. Alzheimer's disease, at its core, involves neurons that are being starved of fuel. Under normal circumstances, glucose is the primary fuel source that powers brain cells. But in the Alzheimer's brain, something happens to the mechanism that lets glucose into neurons. It's often described as a closed door. The glucose is present in the bloodstream, but the neurons increasingly struggle to actually take it in and use it. This connects directly to a much more common and often undiagnosed condition, insulin resistance. When cells throughout the body, including neurons, become less responsive to insulin, glucose has a harder time getting through the cellular door it normally uses. And this process doesn't happen overnight. Research suggests this kind of impaired brain glucose metabolism can be developing quietly for decades before the first noticeable cognitive symptom ever appears, long before a diagnosis would typically be made. The backdoor, ketones. Here's where the story gets genuinely hopeful. There's a second fuel source neurons can use that doesn't depend on that same glucose-insulin doorway at all: ketones. Ketones are molecules your liver produces when you shift toward burning fat for fuel instead of relying primarily on carbohydrates, something that happens during fasting or on a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. Critically, ketones don't need insulin to enter cells the way glucose does. They use a completely different transport mechanism, a back door that stays open even when the glucose front door has become unreliable. Research out of a group at the University of Sherbrooke, led by researcher Stephen Choline, examined people in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease and found something striking. Glucose uptake in their brains was already significantly impaired, exactly as you'd expect. But ketone uptake in those same brains was essentially normal. The back door was still fully functional even while the front door had started closing. This is a major part of why so many people exploring cognitive decline prevention have gravitated toward low carbohydrate and ketogenic approaches. Not as a trend, but because there's a coherent biological mechanism explaining why supplying the brain with an alternative fuel source might help maintain cognitive function even as glucose metabolism becomes less efficient. Addressing the ketone safety concern. There's one commonly cited study that gets brought up whenever ketones come up in a health conversation, one that appeared to show ketones causing cellular damage. It's worth addressing directly because the details matter enormously here. In that research, ketones were administered at extremely high concentrations, levels far beyond what any healthy person would ever naturally produce through diet or fasting. Those concentrations actually mimic a dangerous and specific medical emergency called diabetic ketoacidosis, a condition that occurs almost exclusively in type 1 diabetics who miss insulin doses, allowing ketone levels to spiral to genuinely toxic, uncontrolled levels. This is an entirely different physiological scenario from a healthy person following a low carbohydrate diet, where ketone production is naturally regulated and self-limiting. There's also a detail in that research that rarely gets mentioned when the study is cited as a warning. There are actually 3 distinct types of ketone bodies. And when researchers isolated the dominant type your body naturally produces on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, it produced no adverse effects at all in the same experiments. The concerning results were specific to extreme, non-physiological concentrations, not to the ketone levels a healthy person would ever actually reach through diet alone. Everything else packed into an egg. Before getting into cholesterol specifically, it's worth appreciating just how nutritionally dense a single egg is. Beyond choline and lutein, eggs provide high-quality, complete protein with minimal carbohydrate content, which matters because keeping carbohydrate intake modest helps keep insulin levels lower, supporting exactly the kind of stable blood sugar environment that protects the glucose pathway into neurons discussed earlier. Eggs also contain a meaningful spread of B vitamins, B1, B2, B6, and B12, all of which play direct roles in nervous system function and energy metabolism. They contain trace minerals like iodine and selenium, both important for metabolic and thyroid function. They provide omega-3 fatty acids, an additional antioxidant called zeaxanthin that works alongside lutein, and a solid supply of vitamin E, vitamin D, and folate. It's genuinely one of the most nutrient-dense compact foods available. The cholesterol reversal. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, cholesterol. Eggs contain roughly twice the cholesterol of an equivalent amount of beef. And for decades, that fact alone was enough to get eggs labeled as something to limit or avoid entirely, particularly for anyone concerned about heart health. But here's what that advice missed. Your brain is one of the most cholesterol-dependent organs in your entire body. Cholesterol is a structural component of every neuron's cell membrane, and it's essential for forming the synaptic connections that allow neurons to communicate with each other. Your brain doesn't just use cholesterol, it manufactures a significant portion of its own supply directly, separate from whatever circulates in your bloodstream from diet. And the research on cholesterol levels and cognitive performance tells a story that runs opposite to what most people were taught. Multiple studies have found that people with total cholesterol under 200 tend to perform worse on cognitive testing than people with cholesterol above 240, the range that conventional guidelines have historically flagged as concerning. Low cholesterol, not high cholesterol, has repeatedly shown an association with worse cognitive outcomes in this research. This connects directly to something you may have noticed if you've ever read the fine print on a statin prescription. Statins work by blocking cholesterol production, and the FDA requires every statin medication to carry a warning label specifically for memory loss and cognitive side effects. One large study tracking close to 500,000 people found that the risk of acute memory-related problems was over 4 times higher in the first 30 days after starting a statin compared to before starting it. The 25 eggs a day case study. There's a well-documented case in medical literature of a man who ate 25 eggs every single day for decades. Given the conventional wisdom about dietary cholesterol, you'd expect his cholesterol levels to have been dangerously elevated. Instead, his cholesterol came back within a normal range. When researchers looked closer, they found his cholesterol absorption rate from food was only around 18% compared to the general population average of roughly 50 to 56%. His body had adapted. When dietary cholesterol intake goes up, a healthy liver typically compensates by reducing how much cholesterol it produces internally, and by clearing excess cholesterol more efficiently. The body has genuine regulatory feedback loops built for exactly this situation. This single case doesn't prove eggs are risk-free for everyone in every scenario, but it does illustrate that the simple dietary cholesterol in equals blood cholesterol up model that shaped decades of public health advice is a significant oversimplification of how the body actually regulates cholesterol. Not all eggs are the same. If you're going to make eggs a regular part of your diet, it's worth knowing that how the hens were raised meaningfully changes the nutritional profile of the egg itself. Conventional caged eggs tend to have an omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio around 51:1, heavily skewed toward the more inflammatory omega-6 side. Pasture-raised eggs from hens with access to varied outdoor foraging show a dramatically better ratio, closer to 6-to-1. Since a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is generally associated with lower systemic inflammation, this is a meaningful practical difference, not just a marketing distinction. The same pattern holds for the antioxidants discussed earlier. Pasture-raised eggs consistently measure 4 to 5 times higher in lutein and zeaxanthin content compared to conventional caged eggs. If you have access to a local farmer or farmer's market selling genuinely pasture-raised eggs, that's going to be the higher nutrient option by a wide margin. That said, if pasture-raised eggs aren't accessible or affordable, whether you're a student on a tight budget or simply don't have a local source, conventional eggs are still a nutrient-dense food that outperforms a large share of other common protein and breakfast options. The goal isn't to let the perfect version become the enemy of a genuinely good everyday choice. Practical takeaways. How many, what kind, and when? If you're wondering how to actually apply any of this, a few practical points are worth spelling out clearly. On quantity, the outdated advice limiting healthy adults to a small number of eggs per week per person was largely built on the oversimplified dietary cholesterol model discussed above. For most people without an existing diagnosed lipid disorder, 1 to 3 eggs a day is a reasonable range that lines up with the choline and nutrient targets discussed throughout this video. Though anyone with a specific cardiovascular condition or a genetic cholesterol disorder should work with their own doctor rather than generalize from population-level research. On preparation, how you cook an egg matters more than people assume. Gentle cooking methods, soft boiling, poaching, or a soft scramble at moderate heat, help preserve more of the heat-sensitive nutrients, including some of the choline and antioxidant content, compared to prolonged high-heat frying, which can also oxidize some of the cholesterol in ways that may be less favorable. This doesn't mean a fried egg is harmful, but if you're optimizing specifically for nutrient retention, gentler cooking methods have a slight edge. On sourcing, if pasture-raised eggs aren't in the budget every week, even mixing in pasture-raised eggs occasionally alongside a conventional base is a reasonable middle ground. You don't need an all-or-nothing approach to get meaningful benefit. And on pairing, since one of the core advantages of eggs is how they support stable blood sugar and lower insulin demand, it's worth being mindful of what you eat alongside them. A couple of eggs paired with a stack of white toast and juice partially undercuts the insulin-friendly benefit that makes eggs so useful for the glucose-ketone pathway discussed in Part 2. Pairing eggs with vegetables, avocado, or other low-carbohydrate whole foods keeps that benefit intact. Bringing it all together. So where does this leave you on that original headline? The 47% Alzheimer's risk reduction number is likely comparing broad lifestyle patterns rather than isolating eggs as a single variable. And it comes from research with industry funding worth being aware of. That's a legitimate reason to treat this specific statistic with some skepticism. But set that number aside entirely, and the underlying biology still holds up remarkably well on its own merits. Eggs are one of the most concentrated dietary sources of choline, the direct precursor to the neurotransmitter that Alzheimer's medications are specifically designed to protect. They contain lutein, a nutrient the brain actively prioritizes for protecting nerve insulation. They support a low-carbohydrate, insulin-friendly eating pattern that helps preserve the glucose pathway into neurons for as long as possible. And when that pathway does start to falter, a body accustomed to ketone production has a working backup fuel source ready to go. And the cholesterol they contain, long treated as a liability, turns out to be something the brain actively depends on, with low cholesterol showing a more consistent association with poor cognitive performance than high cholesterol does. None of this means eggs are a guaranteed cure or prevention for Alzheimer's disease. No single food carries that kind of power. And anyone telling you otherwise is oversimplifying a complex, multifactorial disease. But when you look past the headline and into the actual mechanisms, eggs earn their reputation as one of the more genuinely brain-supportive foods available, for reasons that have nothing to do with a single inflated statistic. Quick, honest disclaimer. Nutrition in Alzheimer's research is an active, evolving field, And reasonable experts disagree on interpretation of specific studies, especially around cholesterol, statins, and ketogenic diets. This video reflects one perspective grounded in published research, not medical advice. If you have existing heart disease, high cholesterol under active treatment, or are considering any significant dietary change, talk to your doctor first, especially before making changes to any prescribed medication. A few questions worth bringing to your doctor. If eggs, cholesterol, or ketogenic eating are on your radar after watching this, a short list of questions can make your next appointment far more productive than simply asking, should I eat more eggs? Ask what your actual lipid panel looks like beyond the single total cholesterol number. Specifically, your LDL particle size and pattern, your HDL, and your triglycerides, since these submarkers often tell a more complete story than total cholesterol alone. Ask whether your current cholesterol level, in the context of your full health picture, is more consistent with the research showing better cognitive outcomes at higher levels, or whether you have other risk factors that change that calculation for you personally. If you're on a statin, ask specifically about the memory and cognitive side effect profile, and whether that's something worth monitoring together over the coming months. And if you're considering a lower carbohydrate or ketogenic approach for cognitive or metabolic reasons, ask about baseline blood work before and after, so you have real data on how your body responds rather than relying on how you feel alone. None of this is about walking into an appointment ready to argue with your doctor. It's about having a more informed, two-way conversation grounded in the same mechanistic research covered in this video, rather than either blindly following outdated blanket advice or blindly following a viral headline in the opposite direction. The goal, as always, is an evidence-based middle ground that's actually tailored to your own numbers, your own history, and your own risk profile.